Broadcasting from the commodity capital of the world, Zurich, Switzerland, this is Insider's Guide to Energy.
This edition to Insider's Guide to Energy is brought to you by Fidectis. Go to www.fidectis.com for more information.
Welcome to Insider's Guide to Energy. I'm your host, Chris Sass, and with me, as usual, is Johan Oberg. Johan, how's it going this week?
Doing good, Chris. Doing good. It's been another great week. From an energy point of view, obviously, we have a situation around the world which has some effects as well. But set that aside for the next 45 minutes at least and talk about something more interesting.
Well, I was amused this morning. So as you may know, I come from the DC area. I used to live in the Chesapeake Bay. And one of the news articles that caught my attention this morning, not necessarily energy related, but it had to do with a ship running aground in the Chesapeake Bay from the same company that blocked the canal not so long ago. So it was kind of interesting, seeing the Evergreen ship run aground in the Chesapeake Bay. I thought that was kind of amusing. So it was a little lightened up my day. So apparently they're still running ships aground, but this one's not blocking navigation and less impact on global supply chain. So,
well, we don't need anything more now in terms of that one. I think we had enough of challenges around.
Yeah, we did. Today I'm talking to us from London. I'm over here, another commodity hub. I know I usually am in Zurich for the podcast. I'm over here working with customers over here. You said it was a good week in energy. What did you mean?
No, but I think in general, we've seen a lot of I think initiatives in terms of the green initiatives, and I think we will always come back to the situation that is emerging in the Ukraine and also the legislation and all the political decisions, potentially even forcing this renewable investments and kind of the geopolitical part of being more energy independent. So I think that's kind of an interesting part of following, maybe accelerating now due to unfortunate circumstances. But from a sustainability point of view, I think it's really, really interesting to see what is happening. And I'm really encouraged to hear more about this today as well.
Yeah, I'm interested in today's program. I've just finished reading this book on energy, and it talked about some projections that some analysts had done, and they'd include hydro in there. And in the projections, the author questioned some of the projections because you basically had to replace all the turbines in all the hydro plants in order to get the kind of capacity you're thinking of. But what I believe is I think hydro is certainly a part of the solution. Living in Switzerland, I see hydro all the time. It's a major part of the country we live in. But I'm looking forward to hearing from our guest point of view, where this plays in the sustainable solution and how this helps and what more could be done to leverage it. Because I grew up as a product of the 80s, and when I was growing up, hydro was considered bad, right? It killed fish. It was, I remember my science professors telling me that you didn't want to build these big dam projects and things. And now I live in a country where it's there's hydro all over the place, and it seems to be sustainably doing okay in Switzerland. So it's be interesting to hear where it is in 2022 going forward.
No, I agree, and I think obviously working for a company that is a hydro company by default, my company in Alpic that I've been working for now, we've been doing this for 100 years. So I think it's really, really interesting also to get the view of an outsider from the company to learn a little bit more about it. I think that's quite interesting, but also fascinating to hear about the investment. Where are they coming from? Who's investing, and where is hydro for everyone? This is what I understand very geographically as well in terms of what you can and what you cannot do. So I think we have a lot to explore and unpack in the next.
Let's dive
minutes.
in. Let's bring
it.
Alex Campbell onto the show. Alex, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here.
Well, once again, I have the advantage over our audience is I know who you are and what you do, but maybe you, in your own words, could introduce yourself to the audience of who you are professionally and give a little background on yourself.
Sure, delighted to. So, my name's Alex Campbell. I'm the head of research and policy at the International Hydropower Association. So that's association, as the name suggests, for the hydropower sector. We like to think of ourselves as the voice of sustainable hydropower. We've got just over 100 members active in well over 120 countries. So really trying to promote the role of hydropower in the energy systems of the 21st century, which, well, of course, is increasingly changing, and we will see that shift from the base load provision of hydropower for the, as it's done for the last 100 years, into something which in many markets will be much more a supportive role, helping to integrate those other variable renewables. I came to the IHA in August 2020, so not quite 2 years. And but previous to that, I'd been in a number of government posts in the UK government. I helped to run the contracts for different auctions, which are, as I'm sure many of your listeners will know, the auctions for renewable capacity in the UK. So I led on the policy framework for that. Previous to that, I did international nuclear policy, worked on decisions like the Hinkley Point C decision, spoke with Russian counterparts, Chinese counterparts on various international nuclear matters. Before that, smart meters. So again, a different angle in the decarbonisation story, if you like. And previous to my energy experience, I had about 10 years in regulation, mainly in the tech sector, but also a little bit of media thrown in there as well. But yeah, just over 10 years ago, climate change obviously increasingly important, and it just struck me as an area I wanted to move into and work in. So fast forward, and now I'm helping to promote the case for sustainable hydropower. And you've already touched on some of the challenges, but also the opportunities that we think the sector will have.
So it sounds like you've been in a number of different elements of the energy business. How do they impact and how do they prepare you to be in the hydro industry and sustainable hydro?
Yeah, so I must admit, when I started at Hydropower, I thought, well, I've done 3 years working in nuclear. These guys can't teach me anything about the difficulties of trying to bring NGOs and stakeholders on board on the journey. But I actually found there are some similarities, but some real differences. I mean, as I'm sure you guys know, nuclear power just arouses some really, hot topics and opinions. Some people are just pathologically opposed to them. But the story with hydropower is a bit more nuanced. You touched earlier on the impacts on fish, and certainly in the past there's been some bad projects. We all know that. But over the decades, over a long period of time working with stakeholders, we've developed these sustainability tools, now reflected in the Hydropower Sustainability Standard, to really make sure that projects are delivered with best practice in mind. But nonetheless, there's no getting around the fact that if you're building infrastructure, any type of infrastructure, it has impacts on the natural world. And what I found was, whichever technology you're looking at, whether it's onshore wind, you have opponents; whether it's nuclear power, you have opponents. And when I say opponents, I don't mean irrational, crazy people. I mean rational, sensible, logical, intelligent, well-meaning people who look at something and say, "Oh, we understand about climate change. We understand about the need to electrify, low-income parts of the world, but could you just not do it with this technology here?" And I think, what I've learned from my experience is it's trying to get those conversations going and trying to explain that the big picture, the massive global challenge that we know we all face, not just on climate change, but as the news currently shows, energy security as well.
Which is quite interesting, of course, as a big picture, and coming in with your background to support this. I think it's really really interesting. But at the end of the day, I think it's also, if we look at the organization you represent and the objective of your 100 something members, what would you say is kind of the core objective? Promoting and kind of educating is one thing, but is that really kind of the core objective of the organization, or what would you say is your main objective as part of an organization supporting these 100 something members?
So I think it's to shift the dial, shift the needle, if you like, on getting sustainable hydropower built. We know that if you look at the IEA or the IRENA projections, we know there needs to be a huge increase in the amount of low carbon electricity generation. Now, for hydropower, that's not as significant as it is for wind and solar, where you're talking about a 10 or 20-fold increase. But nonetheless, those organisations still say to have a fighting chance of hitting net zero, we probably need to double the 1,300 gigawatts or so of hydropower that we got today by 2050. So for me and for us, it's about trying to push those policy frameworks, get them into place so that we can actually then develop that hydropower, make sure that governments are supporting it, make sure that the markets are in place to support the services that hydropower provides. And
But is that then, we'll probably touch on this later on as well in terms of the investment part, but is that, out of curiosity, is that also then based versus what? Is that versus fossil fuel, or is that the investments for hydro as a supplement or a complement to wind and solar, or is it actually taking literally investments from other renewable energy sources as solar and adding them to hydro, or how does that work?
so I mean, when you look at the projections, when you look at the numbers, it's clear we need to massively dial back, most obviously on coal, but also on gas. So to the extent that there is money, spare money going around, it could come from there. But that needs to be invested across the piece in flexible low carbon electricity grids. Hydropower is just one component there. So I wouldn't see it as taking it from any other form of low carbon electricity or indeed flexibility. To the extent it's taking money from anywhere, then it should be naturally from the fossil fuels. But you guys know this. There needs to be a huge increase in all forms of low carbon electricity. We can't hang around. We need to really put the foot on the pedal, and we need to do that for obviously solar and wind, but also hydropower, also for flexible smart grids. Biofuels where they can be done sustainably, and of course, nuclear power still needs to increase if we're really to get to net zero.
So I guess you're talking about the increase, and that leads a little bit to the technology, right? So, and I think on the pre-call we covered this high level is, you know, is there enough um, locations and is there enough capacity to really get the hydropower where it needs to be, or is the technology advanced that you can do more with the existing dams and infrastructure in place? Um, Give us an idea of where we're at in the life cycle of hydro.
Yeah, so the simple answer is all of the above, but the longer longer-winded answer is let's take the existing fleet. So it is getting old. I think around half of the 1,300 gigawatts out there today, about 600 gigawatts, is 30 years or more old. If you go down to 40 years, you're looking at about a third, 400 gigawatts. So there is an aging fleet, but that does present an opportunity for modernization, for refurbishment. And typically, without even major equipment upgrades, you can eke out an extra 5 to 10% generation just from doing a decent modernization program. Obviously, with a major refurb, you could potentially get more. So there's potential with the existing fleet to upgrade it, and that's more relevant for Europe, for North America, but also, we're doing a big project at the moment with the African Development Bank. There's old infrastructure in Africa that can do with modernization, so it's not unique to the developed world by any means. But in terms of the potential for new generation and greenfield sites, there is more than enough. When you look at the kind of peer-reviewed scientific literature, it suggests that, to take the most extreme case, perhaps only 10% of the African potential has been touched. In places like Asia, it's 50%. Similarly with South America, question marks over North America. How much is realistically available. But when you factor in large amounts of untapped potential in Canada, then theoretically at least it's there. Obviously, Europe is particularly well developed, but nonetheless there is still greenfield potential in Norway, in Turkey, if you include Turkey in Europe. So there is definitely that potential there, and that's before we even think about things like off-river pump storage hydropower. And I don't know how much your listeners know about pump storage hydropower, but it's a quite clever way of storing energy. You have two reservoirs, And when electricity is cheap, you pump water up the hill, and when it's expensive, you let it back out again. It's a great way of integrating wind and solar, for example, and storing energy. And it's by far and away the most dominant form of grid scale storage at the moment across the world. So when you look at those types of solutions, the potential is absolutely vast because you don't need a running river to develop them. Obviously, then there are costs involved and so on, but as I say, the potential is absolutely.
All right. So what I just heard you say is the fleet is aging. You can get another 5% or 10% out of perhaps what's already infrastructure in place by modernizing it, I think is what I heard you say. I also heard you go on to say that, let's say, certain regions, there's still plenty of untapped resource that's ideal for this. And then you kind of closed with the grid storage, which has been around for a long time, that concept of using grid storage. So why is there an association encouraging hydro? So if it's the panacea that you just described, why isn't it everywhere?
Great question. Yeah, and that's my that's my day job, really, trying to unpick that. One, I forgot to talk about unpowered water infrastructure. Maybe we can come back to that afterwards. So I mean, we look at it. The electricity systems across the world, in particular in liberalized markets, have been changing over the decades. It used to be those vertically integrated utilities who could see the value of an asset like hydropower across all their operations. They could see the things like the inertia that might be provided, black start capability, all those types of sophisticated grid services, as well as the pure energy. As markets have liberalized, and each of the providers of those has been separated out, it's become harder to make the business case because of the way the markets are set up. And in the case of pumped storage hydropower, it's been a particular problem in that when they were originally built, I guess the peak time was maybe the 60s and 70s and even into the 80s. You had nuclear plant running all through the night because it wasn't efficient to turn it off. So it was quite straightforward arbitrage question. You knew electricity was going to be cheap at night, and you knew it was going to be expensive during the day. And to a lesser extent, you had that with coal as well. It was more efficient just to keep the coal systems running through the night. So there was a nice natural fit, even if it wasn't a vertically integrated utility. There was kind of a quite obvious business case. With increasing penetration of wind in particular, I mean, solar is obviously much more predictable than wind. But with wind, as we know, we can get weeks and weeks of strong winds, and then you can have weeks and weeks with very low wind, and just predicting and forecasting those markets becomes much more challenging. And if you're an investor if you're a developer going to an investor saying, well, there's definitely a need here. We've done the maths, but it's quite hard to predict exactly when you're going to get your return. I can understand from the investor's perspective. They go, well, I can go and get a contract for difference for wind turbines. The government of that country is going to guarantee me a price for 15 years. You can't do that. So for us, it's about trying to find mechanisms which aren't a subsidy per se, aren't money, transfer from governments or taxpayers, but are more about just trying to ensure long-term revenue visibility and certainty, with risks being apportioned appropriately. The construction risk should sit with the developers and so on. But we're just seeing that it's not really caught up. The kind of need for those flexible provision, low carbon forms of electricity just hasn't caught up yet.
So if I just touch back on this in terms of the investments, and you mentioned the unpredictability on wind versus maybe a little bit more stable in terms of hydro, but isn't it also a capex or a larger investment for a longer period of time, which makes it a little bit more uncertain in terms of hydro versus wind? Or am I?
I think that's a really fair point when you compare hydro. Now, of course, the kind of the amount of construction you need to do before you can start generating with hydropower is necessarily a high proportion of the ultimate capex, I guess, than it would be with wind. It's probably closer to nuclear in that respect. So you could get a turbine running, but you still, before you put all the turbines in, but you still need to build, if you're doing reservoir storage at the dam, you need to put all those civil works in place. obviously with solar, it's a lot more straightforward, and even with wind, you can, in theory, get some of your turbines up and start getting that return on investment sooner. So it's definitely a feature of hydropower that the point at which you can start getting your return is going to be necessarily later on in the project, and that can understand that from an investor's perspective, that can be troubling, which is why, if we want those flexible sources of low carbon generation on grids in the future, governments and policymakers need to think about these and think about, well, how do we make that work so that we're not caught out in 10-15 years time relying either on gas blackouts, which would obviously be a total disaster, or just betting the house on some really expensive, as yet undeveloped long duration, low carbon but long duration form of energy storage.
So when you look at that, the investors, if we continue on that track, if we look then on, is there a difference between, would you say, between the investors then on, renewable is the new kind of thing, right? We see a lot of money moving into renewables. We've had a number of investors on the show. We have a lot of innovators on the show with acquired quite a lot of money to do this. But would you say that there's a difference then in terms of who invests in what kind of technology? So when we look at wind, it might be a short term or a shorter term in terms of return on the investments on the energy generator, where maybe hydro then is more of an infrastructure investment for a period of long time. Would you say there's a difference in terms of who actually puts up the money and investing in this, or is
It's hard to say. So because we look across the piece globally, and we're not just looking at private sector investment, we're also looking at some of the multilateral financial institutions like the World Bank, like the regional infrastructure banks, and they obviously have a role to play, especially in developing countries. But in respect to private sector investment, I would say, sorry, it's not a very helpful answer, but similar but different. There are some players who are active in both. Copenhagen Infrastructure Partners, for example, you might see them playing in both areas. There will be some who, those investors who want that quicker return, might be more prepared to go into solar and wind. We are obviously keen to encourage the pension funds and the so on to treat hydropower as a an investable asset or class alongside other forms of safe, in inverted commas, infrastructure investment. And there are, when we think about things like sustainability, that's obviously a increasing concern for many investors now, especially institutional investors. And so you have things like the Climate Bonds Initiative, who have criteria for green bonds in hydropower. So to provide that kind of reassurance that they're not going to be caught out if they put their money in something with a load of stakeholder blowback and, of course, negative real world consequences.
So has the market changed? So you talked about kind of the history of where dams and projects were built. In my memory, I kind of have you talked about some of these kind of global funding organizations. To me, it was always kind of a political tool where you could go into a third world country, you build a big dam project, it was feel good, it kind of helped sway to a political will. Has that kind of changed in today's hydro world, or is it still something that it's being used to extend your political reach, right? Because that's the way I look at the old projects. A big dam project seemed to me is kind of more about politics than the actual project, is the way it looked, at least from the cheap seats.
So yeah, I'm absolutely sure some of them are being characterized in that way, and there might well be an element of truth to that. I wouldn't say that's unique to hydropower. Obviously, large infrastructure anywhere can be a vanity project for politicians. That's certainly not unique to hydropower. I think there is more from our discussions with the likes of the African Development Bank, to name one, or World Bank and so on. There is much more of a focus now on that real world benefit, understanding the impacts, understanding where hydropower fits into both the electricity ecosystem, if I can use that phrase, but also its wider social benefits and understanding the impacts, but also the water service benefits. So, flood control, drought resilience, climate change resilience, and adaptation services, and so on. So, I think it's probably not unique to hydropower. I suspect there's been an evolution around the thinking about large scale infrastructure, especially in developing countries across the piece. As I say, not unique to hydropower, but it's worth adding, and I'm sure many of your conversations note this as well. The place which is building the most at the moment is, no great surprise, China. China is absolutely the world leader in hydropower at the moment, and when we look at the numbers that, as I said before, IRENA and IEA are forecasting needs to happen to help get to net zero, if we took China out of the picture, a not particularly great picture would look really, really quite grim. It would be, outside of China, it's it's not been developed anywhere near the pace it needs to be, and there are a number of reasons for that, and I touched on some of those.
So you also mentioned in your intro that hydro should be considered not so much for base load, but also for kind of grid scale storage. So what kind of changes would be supporting that? What's driving that change, and why should that be considered differently?
So yeah, I mean, just to be clear on that, it can obviously be baseload, and there are many countries around the world, Costa Rica's, the Paraguay, or so on, where Norway, where hydropower plays that really important role. But as we see wind and solar plummeting in price, which is fantastic news for the climate, we all know, or those of us who spent a little bit of time thinking about electricity and energy, that you need to have both backup but also integration services, and there's a whole host of really technical stuff that happens that we don't see, which is really difficult to explain to policymakers who are thinking about a million and one different things. And so for us, getting those market arrangements right so that they reward the flexibility, and put the proper value on that kind of flexibility is really essential. And that's where when we talk about things like storage, understanding what's in it for the operator there. Are they being paid just to release as much electricity, sorry, generate as much electricity as they can, or actually are we thinking about some sort of capacity type market type arrangement, or even a more sophisticated one where you're literally paying them not to generate because that resource is available when you have the wind drought, when it's particularly gloomy and overcast. It's these are difficult things as I say, to get into energy ministers' heads. Some of them are very good at it, others, as I say, understandably they're complicated subjects, and you're asking them to, in effect, pay people for what seems like nothing in some cases, but it's incredibly important when you do need it.
Is the message being well received? It's complicated. The solution is complicated no matter what form of energy we're talking about, I find. But so I think you said you came from a regulatory background as well, and in some of your history. So how is it being received?
So we've seen some progress. For example, in the UK put out a call for evidence last year on long duration energy storage. I think they had recognised that there's a gap here, that the UK government does. I say that because I used to work there. Does fantastic modelling on the energy system of the future, and clearly they'd identified that there are going to be these gaps, and so they've really started to sit down and think about it, put out some proposals for possible mechanisms, somewhat akin to the cap and floor arrangement that's in place for interconnectors between Britain and continental Europe, for example. But in other places, you get the sense that people are only now beginning to understand the urgent need to decarbonize, to get coal off the system, so they're seeing the price of wind and solar, and yet you're trying to say to them, and by the way, in 10 years time, 20 years time, you're going to have this problem as well. I understand that's not going to be their priority, and we keep banging the drum. One of our board members, Malcolm Turnbull, who's the former Prime Minister of Australia, he talks about the crisis within the crisis, because he saw this when he was Prime Minister of Australia, the risk of blackouts, and so heavily promoted the Snowy Mountain 2 pump storage hydro facility whilst he was in office, because he recognised it and could see it. And I think the worry is, I guess, that policymakers will make this tomorrow's problem. And then, as we all know, suddenly tomorrow's problem becomes today's problem, and everybody's scrambling around desperately trying to find a solution.
So I get the long-term nature. Now, I can't help thinking, once again, this goes back to that whole thinking about dams and things, and being American, thinking about watching videos of the Hoover Dam being built. And I grew up about a mile from the Niagara power plant, so very familiar with hydro my whole existence. What comes to mind is the amount of concrete involved in these. So you're talking about carbon change and things like that. So do modern dams use less concrete? Because I think concrete has a very high carbon output when you use carbon. So how does that offset? You build a big dam project today, you may be creating green energy, but you're also creating carbon, are you not?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, any infrastructure has embedded carbon in it. Hydropower is quite unusual in that the kind of biggest concern with hydropower, in particular with hydropower that uses reservoirs, is when you flood an area, you cause the organic material that was previously not underwater to die, and break down and release climate gases, so methane and carbon dioxide. And the kind of bigger concern, rather than the concrete that's embedded in the walls, is actually the emissions from that. Is it anaerobic? I think it's anaerobic breakdown. Don't quote me on that though. And we and others have looked into that, and there's been a lot of studies. Our friends at UNESCO fund a program at the University of Quebec in Montreal. The UNFCCC has looked at the embedded emissions across different technologies, and I'll get to the point. Hydropower is actually very favourable at a median point compared to other technologies. So the numbers are around, I think it's 12 grams per kilowatt hour for nuclear. Wind is in about the same place. These are over a life cycle, so over the lifespan of technologies. Hydropower is a bit higher, around the mid 20s. Solar is about 40, for example, and then gas is 300 plus, something like that. Coal 800 plus. So yes, there is absolutely emissions embedded in the concrete. Like I say, it's actually probably more important to think about the reservoirs, but on a median basis over the whole lifespan of the infrastructure, it's actually pretty low and well within the limits that we need to put in place to hit net zero.
How does that come with investors, if we connect the investors back then to the sustainability value? Because I think sustainability is driving the investments for many of the new investors around this, or even the old ones. And if I just take an analogy, quite a few years ago, I bought a diesel car. It was actually subsidized due to the fact that it was an environmentally friendly car. And obviously some new research came out, and it's not so sustainable at the end of the day. This is a car that, okay, big investment for me quite a few years ago, but if I am institutional investors, we're talking millions and millions for the next 30 years, and suddenly something changed, and new research comes out and says that hydro is not specifically sustainable. Then how do you work with the investors around this? Because what kind of interesting here is that it is a long-term commitment or investment that kind of shifts a little bit of the momentum around it.
Absolutely, and there's a number of ways to reassure investors in that regard. So I think I mentioned earlier, we've got for example, the Climate Bonds Initiative, and they have criteria for for green bonds, as it were, and they reference tools that can be used with hydropower. And that, for example, I think there's a 50-gram limit for projects, if for a project to be sustainable in that respect in terms of emissions. The EU taxonomy has similar sorts of limits, and we've got the hydropower sustainability standard, which isn't actually the IHA standard. It's an independent council which IHA works closely with, of course, but as do NGOs, as does the World Bank, and so on, to really set using a suite of tools that have been developed over many years, some really cutting edge in the world of sustainability criteria for assessment. So an investor can come in and if they want to can request an assessment using those tools or ultimately against the standard, and so reassure themselves that they're not going to get bitten here, that this is now a widely recognized mechanism for demonstrating compliance with those really important ESG aspects that, of course, many people are concerned about.
So, I get Johan's question. I guess I'm still kind of thinking that the way you describe this is hydropower is just part of a solution that's an ecosystem. You talked about the grid and other green energy is part of this, right? So are you part of your day job helping create the rest of the infrastructure to support, because just having power generated somewhere and going into a poor grid design or something like that's probably not all that helpful. You talked about the legislation or perhaps some of the regulation to go along with it so that you have a favorable market condition to support this. So what's kind of the whole ecosystem you're working with, I guess, is my question. So you get the dams and you got the studies, you talk about some of these different agencies, you talk about the funding, you got the investment angle that Johan's going down. But and I think you talked about regulation. What's the whole picture look like? Maybe you can color that for us.
Yes, I mean, grid connections and interconnectivity is obviously critically important. It's important for hydropower, it's important for all the technologies. And we do, where we can, work with some of those organizations which are trying to promote green grids, as it were, around the world to make sure that there is clever planning, at that kind of big scale infrastructure level to work out, well, where should we put the grid reinforcement in place. And we would turn around and say, for example, in some regimes, the grid operator isn't allowed to operate generating equipment, which means they can't get pump storage hydropower in place, even if that's actually the most cost effective way of them managing their grids, because of its ability to quickly react to supply and demand. We also think about clever uses of existing infrastructure, and floating solar PV hybrids with hydropower are one really interesting example of that, where you can maximize the use of a reservoir, especially important in countries with high population densities. And Southeast Asia, we're seeing this increasingly with obviously great solar irradiance as well, but taking advantage of the grid connection that the hydropower facility already has to lower the cost of the floating solar facility, but also reduce some of the wear and tear on the hydropower equipment. So that kind of clever use of different types of equipment together, which sometimes requires the breaking down of barriers, because you might have a legacy state-owned regime in Laos operating the hydropower facility, who just thinks, why do I want to get involved with solar? And we've seen some really interesting cases where developers have come in, where international aid agencies have come in and talked them through and shown how it's in that classic phrase, a win-win for everybody to do exactly that. We're also thinking, it's not always, there are some fantastic hydropower resources which are a long way from grid connections, and there's something like hydrogen comes in. We see in some more remote parts of the world hydropower used for, say, aluminium smelting, which isn't necessarily connected to the grid, but it's it's kind of that self-contained, lower cost model. And you might see in the future hydrogen being produced with hydropower in remote areas, because it's cheaper to ship the gas or ammonia even than it is to ship electricity. And hydropower's got actually quite a long history with making hydrogen. It was, I think, back in the 1920s, there were facilities in Norway, for example, mainly for use then in fertilizers, and they kind of wound down through the 20th century. But it clearly the potential is there.
Someone brought
Hydrogen
a
is obviously
seagull to someone brought a seagull to this call.
fantastic, sustainable. We got the wildlife in there. That's great. If we look at hydrogen, maybe just quickly on it, where do you see the? I like the way you explained this on the localized part, but where do you see other kind of short-term applications for then the green hydrogen?
So I mean, hydrogen is fascinating. It's been seen as that great green hope, and when you look at it, certainly from a technological perspective, that seems to be the case. And there's some really interesting discussions going on, in countries like Britain at the moment about how do you decarbonize domestic heating, because that at the moment you've got, do you go down the gas route? There's existing infrastructure in place in Britain, pipelines and so on, that would need to be modified, and boilers again, which would need to be modified. Or do you go for pure electrification and then put heat pumps in place and so on? But those require much more significant investments in insulation, and much more significant changes to people's houses. And if there's anything about the battle against climate change, it's that making people change behavior is a lot harder than just putting some wind turbines up offshore. Even that creates some opposition, but completely restructuring people's houses is difficult. So I mean, I really want to see green hydrogen succeed, or low carbon hydrogen. There might be a role for blue or pink hydrogen as well. But we do need to see hydrogen being rolled out. I think first and foremost, and I'm sure you guys will have an opinion on this as well, it will go to those hard to abate sectors. So high temperature heat, long distance vehicles, then maybe into that lower grade heat, depending on the costs, like I say, with things like domestic heating. But it could, of course, ultimately be used for generating electricity, and that'll be a challenge for the hydropower sector. I've talked a lot about the important role of hydropower in providing that backup and that resilience. You could do that with hydrogen. I think that's got to be the last use of hydrogen. Surely we want to use hydrogen for air travel if it's feasible, for the high temperature heat that I talked about beforehand. But they certainly could be a role for hydropower. It's got that in the right place, the high capacity factors to justify keeping the electrolyzers on all the time. As I say, you could have a really nice arrangement with the localized users very close to the manufacture of the hydrogen. But this is playing out, and I'm sure you guys, as I say, have lots of thoughts on that. It's going to play out in a really interesting way over the next 5-10 years.
No, for sure. And I think we've had a few people on the show, and I think it's also always fascinating because I think the interaction also between other industries, if we talk about transport, for example, I think for the first time, energy industry is kind of in the backseat of actually making that technology shift. It's actually going to come from someone else, and the energy needs to adapt to it. But I'm always curious to hear a little bit about the hydrogen, but I'm going to drop it now because I think we're also running a little bit on topics. So maybe move back a little bit to hydrogen.
To hydrogen or to hydro?
To hydro. Sorry, you're right.
We've all done that.
I was like, oh, okay.
Every time I talk to someone about hydropower and hydrogen, someone gets the two mixed up. It's
So I guess with hydrogen, right, it's a density question, right? You talked about aviation or maybe long haul trucking or some other things like that. And how does the storage and the use of water to for pump storage and things like that, how does it compete? I mean, it's very dense, I would imagine, for energy.
absolutely. So water is dense, and you can even use higher density liquids to drive turbines as well. And I know there are some interesting companies and technologies at play there. I guess the kind of the argument versus, or not the argument, but the kind of discussion with hydrogen is you can use hydrogen for so many things in so many different ways, and I'm sure once the mechanisms are right, it will start being produced at scale. And I think for the hydropower sector, we'll keep using water to generate electricity. We're not going to use it directly to power aircraft, of course. That would be a fantastic thing. Although I think hydrogen, to be fair, is quite some way doing that just yet as well. But it's a more focused role for hydropower than hydrogen. That will go across the piece and revolutionize the whole energy sector, I think.
So where does hydropower work well, and where does it not work well? Like where would you recommend it, and where would you not? Like, so what are the pros and cons for hydro?
So places I wouldn't recommend it, probably not in the desert, for obvious reasons. No, I mean the kind of the it all depends what you're looking for and what types of impacts you're concerned about and what the rest of your energy mix is. But in simple engineering terms, you're looking for height and mass of water. The higher the head, so the distance between the top and where the water's coming out and driving the turbine, the better. That's why we have lots of hydropower facilities up in mountains. It's incredibly energy efficient and powerful there. And obviously, if you've got big rivers, that's beneficial as well. I think the interesting places to start thinking about where it work well in the future in terms of greenfield sites are, well, I don't actually know if they count as greenfield sites. So unpowered water infrastructure. There's, according to ICOL, the International Commission on Large Dams, there's something like 50,000 large dams around the world. Less than 20% of those, fewer than 20%, are hydropower facilities. There's a huge amount of infrastructure out there that's already, if you like, there's a sunk environmental cost. It's caused the negative impact already. Why don't we try and utilize some of that infrastructure? I know that's something that the NGOs, even some of our most critical friends, are keen on because they see that as being a benefit. And obviously, places like Europe are absolutely full of obstacles in natural waterways, but even across Africa, across Asia, there are still thousands and thousands of these obstacles. I say that makes it sound negative. They're there for irrigation purposes, there for navigation, for flood control, drought control, and these sorts of things. And they won't all be right for utilizing with hydropower, but some of them will be, and it's a tremendous potential there. But it's the usual kind of public policy barriers and issues that are stopping them being developed. Who owns it? Who's got responsibility for that infrastructure? Do they have anything to do with the people who are responsible for energy? Are they different again from the people responsible for water? Do those departments speak to each other? Are some of them privatized? All these sorts of things which make a simple or relatively simple engineering challenge really, really difficult are at play when we think about issues like that.
And what's your organization's role in a project like that? Are you involved in these projects, or are you just an advocate to get people to consider it?
So we don't specifically advocate for any individual projects. I mean, we will do our best to showcase best practice, of course, but we are very interested in working with partners to try and map out and understand where that potential is. And we're in dialogue actually at the moment with a number of stakeholders, both from the energy sector, but also environmentalists and climate change advocates, to really try and get that really sophisticated understanding, down to the river level of where there is the potential. It would be for others to develop it, others to understand, what the concerns are that they would wish to see brought into consideration there, others to, put forward the potential for interconnections that we talked about earlier, or so on. But yeah, it's very much, when we're talking about issues like that, a partnership with other organizations.
So I think as a kind of follow up, we discussed a lot about the politics around it. We talked about the financial around this, and obviously, I think we all agree on this one that the hydro is something that will be a fundamental part in this energy transition. You also mentioned a little bit about the growth in terms of China leading the way, which in many ways, not just for hydro, but specifically. We went through a little bit on kind of pumped run of river and kind of storage in terms of this one, but kind of just a little bit of a for our listeners and including myself. Do you see anything specific, some new technology, something specific that you think this will actually have an impact, or is it more improving the processes that we have and expanding regionally or number-wise on what we have?
So I won't bore you with too many statistics, but we talked earlier, we need maybe 1,300 gigawatts by 2050, alongside a load of other technologies. We've assessed the pipeline, and there's about 550 gigawatts in there at the moment, and fewer than 200 gigawatts of that is actually under construction. There is a huge gap between what we think is needed and what is actually being built. So that's kind of a slightly alarming thing for me and the sector, because it's not just important for hydropower. That's a huge amount of low carbon electricity generation. If it doesn't happen, are we going to really be able to build other technologies at that kind of huge scale that's needed? So for me, it's about working with the partners who perhaps are concerned about the impacts of hydropower, and just trying to get everybody to look at that big picture. If we have 20 times as much solar and 10 times as much wind, there are going to be electricity cables across the globe. It's going to be absolutely smothered for understandable and good reasons. We need to keep looking at this as a holistic problem, or look at it holistically, to try and get to an accommodation, which means that people accept development, though it's not ideal, to push back against climate change. Yeah, I don't know if that's quite answered your question, but I thought it's just important to have that reality check on where we are with the numbers.
So I think we've gone pretty much all over the place in this conversation. So what I'm hearing is that there's a gap in the projects that exist in the need. You wanted to ask some funding questions of who's funding these, and are there concerns with some of the modeling and the long-term nature, the nature of the beast. And it sounded like you have to work with different governments and also global organizations to kind of help make these things come to fruition. Are you bullish about us being successful? I mean, you obviously changed roles. You've dedicated yourself to working in this energy sector. Um, what's your crystal ball telling you about the future? How are we going to do on this? What's the reality check?
So I'm a natural optimist. I really am, but it's borderline on this. I think we really need to see governments focusing on long-term system-wide planning and understanding what's coming down, understanding the gap they're going to have coming down the track. And then hydropower will have a role. I'm sure of that. It won't be the answer to everything, of course, but it will have a role. If they don't do that, then then I am worried, both for the sector but also more generally against about tackling climate change, because I think it will be next to impossible to get to net zero unless you have really sophisticated forms of long duration energy storage. And yeah, I do try and be positive. I do try and be optimistic, but there are just some big gaps at the moment, and I really would ask people who are concerned about the infrastructure impacts of hydropower, you need to look at the long-term climate change impacts. That's so important. If you've got a better solution, please come forward with it now. The world needs it right now. If it's not hydropower, you've got to find something else super quickly.
Well, cool. Johan, any final questions or thoughts?
No, I think we'll leave it on that note. I thought that was a really brilliant finishing in terms of it. And I think we all agree on this one. We're running out of time in many ways. And I think this shift, even though we see very good signs, and we bring up quite a few of them on this show from technology, etc. But as you mentioned many times, we're talking about scale. This is not a small thing change. So a few small technologies here and there will not do it. So I thought that was a really good ending. And I want to thank you for joining.
Thank you very much for having me. Pleasure.
It's been a pleasure having you on the show. And for our audience, we hope you've enjoyed this conversation, finding more about hydro and some of the projects and some of the needs. It's been informative to me. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please share it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe, and we look forward to speaking to you again next week. Bye-bye.